The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. I now invite the House to rise and observe a minute's silence in memory of His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. We meet today to pay tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh, who has been at the side of Her Majesty the Queen for more than 7 decades, giving his unwavering support both as a husband and as a consort. Described by Her Majesty as my strength and my stay, For most of us, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, has always been there, providing this nation with a reassuring presence. Whether it's with such dignity attending the formal occasions, when the Queen attended Parliament for the state opening, or for visiting different places within the UK, or an overseas country, his support and loyalty was always clearly displayed. He was the longest-serving consort in history and the oldest partner of a serving monarch. He never let the Queen down. His passing also marks the end of an era as one of the last surviving heroes of the Second World War, serving as an officer in the Royal Navy with distinction and heavily decorated for his bravery and long service. A qualified pilot, he gained his helicopter wings, became Admiral of the Fleet for over 50 years. He helped to design the Royal Yacht Britannia. He visited troops in Iraq and travelled with the Queen throughout the Commonwealth and overseas territories, and only stepped down from official royal duties at the age of 96. Outspoken, with a great sense of humour, he wasn't afraid of talking openly about issues that were close to him. He will be remembered for his loyal devotion to service and his leadership of hundreds of causes close to his heart. Perhaps his finest achievement was the Duke of Edinburgh's award, which helped millions of young people around the world to achieve their full potential as team members and future leaders in their chosen field. As a moderniser and public reformer, he was promoted the latest in engineering and design. As a pioneer in World Wildlife Fund, he travelled widely to secure the public interest in the nature and its protection. His sporting interests were wide-ranging. As a sailor, he regularly attended Cowes Week for the regatta. He was a cricket enthusiast and a player. He also took part in horse riding and performed as a top polo player. He was a winner for Britain too at the courage driving, which he took up later in life. In March 2011, the Duke accompanied the Queen to Parliament for the Diamond Jubilee celebrations. I had the pleasure of introducing him to groups of members waiting to greet him. I remember his interest about ties. Members were wearing particularly if it showed a connection with the armed forces. He also had a special ability to put people at ease. As we reflect on the life well lived, we should not forget the wide-ranging achievements of Prince Philip. The ambassador, the serviceman, the scientist, artist, naturalist, committee chairman, traveller, loyal supporter of the United Kingdom, the overseas territories and the Commonwealth. But we should always remember him as a family man, a devoted husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. He was without doubt the father of the nation. He will surely be missed and impossible to replace. I now call the Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that an humble address be presented to Her Majesty, expressing the deepest sympathies of this House on the death of His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and the heartfelt thanks of this House and this nation for his unfailing dedication to this country and the Commonwealth, exemplified in his distinguished service in the Royal Navy in the Second World War, his commitments to young people in setting up the Duke of Edinburgh's award, a scheme which has touched the lives of millions across the globe, his early passionate commitment to the environment and his unstinting support to Your Majesty throughout his life. Mr. Speaker, it is fitting that on Saturday His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh will be conveyed to his final resting place in a Land Rover which Prince Philip designed himself with a long wheelbase and capacious rear cabin, because that vehicle's unique and idiosyncratic silhouette reminds the world that he was above all a practical man who could take something very traditional, whether a machine or indeed a great national institution, and find a way by his own ingenuity to improve it, to adapt it for the 20th and the 21st century. That gift for innovation was apparent from his earliest career in the Navy. When he served in the Second World War, he was mentioned in dispatches for his alertness and appreciation of the situation during the Battle of Cape Matapan. And he played a crucial role in helping to sink 2 enemy cruisers. But it was later, during the invasion of Sicily, that he was especially remembered by his crewmates for what he did to save their own ship. In a moment of high danger, at night, when HMS Wallace was vulnerable to being blown up by enemy planes, he improvised a floating decoy, complete with fires to make it look like a stricken British vessel, so that the Wallace was able to slip away and the enemy took out the decoy. He was there at Tokyo Bay in 1945, barely 200 yards away from the Japanese surrender on the deck of USS Missouri. But he wasn't content just to watch history through his binoculars. It seems that he used the lull to get on with repainting the hull of HMS Whelp. And throughout his life, a life that was of necessity, wrapped from such a young age in symbol and ceremony, one can see that same instinct to look for what was most useful, for most practical, and what would take things forward. He was one of the first people in this country to use a mobile phone. In the 1970s, he was driving an electric taxi on the streets of London, the forerunner of the modern low-carbon fleet, and again, a vehicle of his own specifications. He wasn't content just to be a carriage driver. He played a large part in pioneering and codifying the sport of competitive carriage driving. And if it is true, Mr. Speaker, that carriage driving is not a mass participation sport, not yet, he had other novel ideas that touched the lives of millions, developed their character and confidence, their teamwork and self-reliance. It was amazing and instructive to listen on Friday to the Cabinet's tributes to the Duke and to hear how many of them were proud to say that they or their children had benefited from taking part in his Duke of Edinburgh award schemes. I will leave it to the House to speculate as to who claimed to have got a gold award and who got a bronze. But I believe those ministers spoke for millions around the world, across this country, who felt that the Duke had in some way touched their lives. People whose work he supported in the course of an astonishing 22,219 public engagements. People he encouraged and people, yes, that he amused. It is true that he occasionally drove a coach and horses through the finer points of diplomatic protocol. And he coined a new word, dontopedology, for the experience of putting your foot in your mouth. And it is also true, Mr. Speaker, that amongst his more parliamentary expressions, he commented adversely on the French concept of breakfast. He told a British student in Papua New Guinea that he was lucky not to be eaten, and the people of the Cayman Islands that they were descended from pirates, and that he would like to go to Russia, except that, as he put it, the bastards murdered half my family. But, Mr. Speaker, the world did not hold it against him. On the contrary, they overwhelmingly understood that he was trying to break the ice, to get things moving, to get people laughing, and to forget their nerves. And to this day, there is a community in the Pacific Islands that venerates Prince Philip as a god or a volcano spirit, a conviction that was actually strengthened when a group came to London to have tea with him in person. When he spoke so feelingly about the problems of overpopulation and humanity's relentless incursion on the natural world and the consequent destruction of habitat and species, he contrived to be at once politically incorrect and also ahead of his time. In a quite unparalleled career of advice and encouragement and support, he provided one particular service that I believe we in the House know in our hearts was the very greatest of all. In the constant love he gave to Her Majesty the Queen as her liege man of life and limb, in the words he spoke at the coronation, he sustained her throughout this extraordinary second Elizabethan age, now the longest reign of any monarch in our history. It was typical of him that in wooing Her Majesty, famously not short of a jewel or two, he offered jewellery of his own design. He dispensed with the footmen in powdered wigs. He introduced television cameras, and at family picnics in Balmoral he would barbecue the sausages on a large metal contraption that all Prime Ministers must have goggled at for decades, complete with rotisserie and compartments for the sauces, that was, once again, Mr. Speaker, a product of his own invention and creation. Indeed, as an advocate of skills and craft and science and technology, this country has had no royal champion to match him since Prince Albert, and I know that in due course the House and the country will want to consider a suitable memorial to Prince Philip. It is with that same spirit of innovation that, as co-gerent of the royal family, he shaped and protected the monarchy through all the vicissitudes of the last 7 decades, and helped to modernise and continually to adapt an institution that is above politics, that incarnates our history, and that is indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life. By his tireless, unstinting service to the Queen, the Commonwealth, the armed forces, the environment, to millions of young people and not so young people around the world, and to countless other causes, he gave us, and he gives us all, a model of selflessness and of putting others before ourselves. And though I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that he might be embarrassed or even faintly exasperated to receive these tributes, he made this country a better place, and for that he will be remembered with gratitude and with fondness for generations to come.
The question is that the humble address be presented to Her Majesty as on the order paper. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In supporting the humble address, I'd like to echo the remarks made by the Prime Minister, and on behalf of my own party, to come together today in appreciation of a life well lived, a life of service and of duty, a life that shaped modern Britain and provided much-needed stability to our national story. My thoughts, first and foremost, are with Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family. Prince Philip was a man of many titles: Duke of Edinburgh, Lord High Admiral, a Royal Commander, Baron of Greenwich. But above all, he was a much-loved father, grandfather and great-grandfather. To Her Majesty the Queen, he was not only her beloved husband, he was, in her words, her strength and stay for 7 decades. So it's right that today this House and the country comes together to pay tribute not just to a man, but to the virtues he personified, and to his ceaseless optimism about the country Britain can be and what the British people can achieve. The life of Prince Philip was extraordinary, lived in a century on fast forward, a time that saw World War, a Cold War, the fall of empire, 20 prime ministers, the invention of the television, the internet, artificial intelligence, and technology so extraordinary it might have seemed to a lesser person as if from another world. Throughout that time, the monarchy has been the one institution for which the faith of the British people has never faltered. And as we've seen once again in recent days, the royal family has a connection with the British people that runs as deep today as it did when Philip Mountbatten married the then Princess Elizabeth in 1947. That is not by chance. It reflects the quiet virtues, the discipline, and the sacrifices we commemorate today. My own connection to the Duke of Edinburgh began long before I entered this place. Like millions of other children, aged 14, I started the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, the D.A.V. as we called it. My first activity was to volunteer at a local mental health hospital, where, unbeknown to me at the time, my late granddad would later be admitted. And my final activity was wandering around Dartmoor in a small team with a compass and a map in the pouring rain, frantically trying to find our way. Mr. Speaker, if that doesn't prepare you for coming into politics, nothing will. And in recent days, I've been struck by the countless stories of lives turned around by the D.A.V. Awards. Young people who found their confidence and found their way. This was summed up by a 14-year-old girl who said, on passing her Bronze Award, that she felt, I can do anything now. The D.A.V. now covers 130 countries and has helped millions of people around the world. It is perhaps the best symbol of the Duke's global legacy. He was, of course, also patron to more than 800 charities and organisations. He was the first president of the World Wildlife Fund. He was the patron of the British Heart Foundation. He was president of BAFTA, and he was Chancellor of the Universities of Cambridge, Edinburgh, Salford and Wales. He carried out, as has already been said, staggering more than 22,000 solo engagements and countless others alongside Her Majesty the Queen. The Duke will also be remembered for his unstinting support of our armed forces. It was in Dartmouth in 1940 that he graduated as a naval cadet and, as the Prime Minister has described, went on to a distinguished naval career. Today, Mr. Speaker, the British Armed Forces mourn one of their greatest champions. The Duke was a funny, engaging, warm and loving man. He loved to paint. His work has been described characteristically as totally direct, no hanging about, strong colours, vigorous brushstrokes. He was also a great lover of political cartoons, and not something the Prime Minister and I can say that often. Although I saw a cartoon this weekend that I think captured this moment of national and personal loss perfectly. It depicted Her Majesty, dressed in black, looking back at her shadow and seeing the Duke standing there, as ever at her side, attentive and holding her hand. Mr. Speaker, Britain will not be the same in his absence. For most of us, there's never been a time when the Duke of Edinburgh was not present. At every stage of our national story, for the last 7 decades, he's been there, a symbol of the nation we hope to be at our best, a source of stability, a rock. Her Majesty once said, "Grief is the price we pay for love." The Duke loved this country, and Britain loved him in return. That is why we grieve today. But we must also celebrate him. A life lived in strong and vigorous brushstrokes, like his painting. And we offer up this tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh for a lifetime of public service, the Gold Award. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I now call the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Prince Philip, I think, would have laughed at the Leader of the Opposition's jest about finding a compass and comparing it with politics. The Leader of the Opposition, following the Prime Minister's excellent speech, also spoke about the titles that the Duke of Edinburgh held. One was the Maharaja of Not Very Much. This is a polite translation of a title given to him by Sir Reggie Bennett MP, when at the Thursday Club, Prince Philip volunteered to join the Imperial Puna Yacht Club. I'll return to that later if I may. There have been fair and full tributes in many of our papers, and I pay tribute to journalists who, from a standing start, have managed to go on providing interesting reading. And I mention not as the best, but as one of the most recent, Alice Thompson and Libby Purvis in today's Times newspapers are good. And for those who think that only the House of Commons is having this, the House of Lords have also had some really good speeches, including those by, to mention just a few, Lord Boyce, Lord Allardyce, Lord Janvrin and Lord Delakia. I hope that what we say here will be of interest to those who pay attention to the proceedings in Parliament. In your House, Mr. Speaker, Prince Charles observed to George Thomas, then later Lord Tonopandi, that if the Duke of Edinburgh or he never said anything interesting, they were accused of being dull. If they weren't dull, they were accused of being controversial. Each of them was willing to lead on issues that weren't already fashionable or dominant among popular concerns. In 1952, on the death of his father-in-law, Prince Philip became patron of the Industrial Society, which followed on from the Duke of York camps. That then developed number 3 Carlton House Terrace, for a time called Peter Runge House. It's now known as Prince Philip House. It's the headquarters of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And it was in developing the Fellowship of Engineers and later the Royal Academy that Prince Philip managed to give attention and pay tribute to the successful endeavours of many people who should be regarded as important as those who studied economics, politics, or the classics. Prince Philip was guest of honour at the Taxi Charities 1979 visit to Worthing, and with Her Majesty the Queen at Durrington High School in 1999, he met all kinds of members of the community, the kind of engagement which matters a lot in each of our constituencies. We remember they did it in all constituencies all over the country. I referred to Reggie Bennett. He is quoted as saying that the Imperial Puna Yacht Club had 25 really excellent sailing members and that Prince Philip was an honorary member, which was a backhanded compliment to one of the best sailors around. Prince Philip, and I'm going to conclude with this, but it's quite a long quotation, in the foreword to the book of the club's history, wrote, "It's true that all the members are serious yachtsmen, in the sense they're rather good at it. What's equally important is they all share a keen appreciation of the value of anti-seriousness. If you can bring yourself to read this book from cover to cover, you'll be in a position to judge for yourself whether or not life can be significantly improved by not taking it too seriously all the time."
We now come to Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me begin by echoing the warm and thoughtful words of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and indeed the Father of the House who has spoken before me. Since the news emerged last Friday of Prince Philip's death, the time since has been filled with genuine sorrow right across these islands. For myself and for people throughout Scotland, my thoughts and prayers remain with the entire royal family, but most especially with Her Majesty the Queen. Because I think for most people, the response and the reaction has been very simple and purely human. We collectively grieve for a wife who has lost her husband, a mother who has lost her life partner and her constant companion after a remarkable 73 years of marriage. In the past few days, across our institutions and across the media, there has been a very public marking and mourning of the passing of the Duke of Edinburgh. These tributes indeed have come from every corner of the world. I'm very conscious, though, that this scale of public commemoration doesn't diminish the depths of private grief. Because at the very heart of this is a family grieving the loss of a beloved husband, a father, a grandfather and great-grandfather, a man who was at the very centre of their family life. As with every death, following the funeral, that loss and absence will be felt all the more. It is right that we seek to remember and respect that loss and the need for private mourning in the days, weeks and months ahead. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to reflecting on the life of Prince Philip, there is no shortage of material. His was a remarkable life, packed full of experience and involvement spanning across diverse communities and continents. That life and those experiences were made possible by probably his most defining trait, a devotion to duty. Already today in this chamber and across the airways for the past few days, there have been great insights into that long life and the period of history in which he had a presence or a part. From military service, promotion of environmental causes or his patronage of more than 800 organisations, there is a long and lasting legacy to reflect on. It would be impossible to encapsulate all of it in any remarks. Instead, I will focus my remarks on the Duke's deep connection to Scotland. That connection came before and went way beyond a royal title that contained our capital city of Edinburgh. It was a connection that stretched right across his entire life, from childhood to old age. As a child, he attended school at Gordonston, and it was there that he established many of his interests and hobbies that would stay with him. In those early years, he made his mark as an athlete in cricket and in hockey, captaining the school teams and becoming head of the school. And the Duke's love of the sea first found its spark in Scotland, where he frequently went on school trips sailing around the coast of Scotland. His affection for his time at Gordonston is obviously demonstrated by the fact that he sent all his sons there in later years. He also remained a regular visitor, most recently in 2014, to mark Gordonston's 80th anniversary. That link with Scotland and the Highlands only grew and deepened after his marriage to Queen Elizabeth. The love they have for Balmoral Castle has been evident for years, and their presence there each summer now part of the fabric of that local community. Whether it was his attendance at the Braemar Gathering, a Highland tradition that has been ongoing for the best part of 900 years, or his presence at Cratty Kirk, Balmoral became an enduring part of their life together. Despite his ailing health, it is very telling that he still made the effort to make his final journey to Balmoral as recently as last August. Mr. Speaker, I suspect for many people the most memorable and impactful legacy that Prince Philip leaves is the scheme that he lent his title to, the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. Once again, the Scottish connection with the scheme couldn't be clearer. It was inspired by the Murray Badge created by Dr. Kurt Hann, the founder of Gordonston, with the intention of giving a sense of responsibility. Those tasks in the scheme, from volunteering, outdoor expeditions and personal development, have helped community and educational organisations for generations. Since its establishment in 1956, it is truly incredible to reflect that more than 6 million people have undertaken the Duke of Edinburgh Award in the UK since its inception. But its reach didn't stop there, with more than 130 countries participating in the international award across the globe. The Duke was a very hands-on patron, and he personally attended the scheme's award ceremonies, presenting his 500th Gold Award in 2013 at St James's Palace. That emphasis and commitment that Prince Philip placed in the value of education was the mainstay of his life. The Duke was appointed Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh in 1953 and served in that role for almost 60 years. During that long period, he took a particularly keen interest in scientific development and was a regular at graduation ceremonies. He only retired in 2010, and I know that the staff and students at the university also valued the role and the time he willingly gave. Mr. Speaker, it has also been noted in recent days that Prince Philip took a keen interest in Scottish architecture. There are very memorable photographs circulating of when the Prince joined the Queen to open the Forth Road Bridge in 1964. They were the first people to cross the link between the Kingdom of Fife and that great city of Edinburgh. And that enduring interest with the Forth crossing was replicated some 50 years later when he made a private visit to see the construction of the Queensferry crossing. Once again, alongside the Queen, they became the first people to cross the new bridge after it officially opened in 2017. Now, I know that political campaigning remains suspended, but I'm sure that members opposite will forgive me for saying that I'm pretty sure that Prince Philip would have appreciated that the bridge was delivered on time and under budget. Mr. Speaker, perhaps people's most lasting memories of the Duke were the informality he often brought to very formal occasions. Throughout the years, I think it's fair to say that he wasn't a man for drizzling honey on his words. That trait equally applied to the advice he gave, and there is one memorable piece of advice he gave on the length of speeches, which I dare say some members might even think applies to myself. When it came to the length of a speech, he advised, "What the backside cannot endure, the brain cannot absorb." With that timeless piece of advice from the Duke of Edinburgh, I shall bring my remarks to a close. In doing so, though, I again convey the condolences of myself, of my party and the people right across Scotland to the Queen and to the entire royal family. By any standard, by any measure, Prince Philip's lived a long, energetic and full life. May he now rest in peace.
Right Honourable Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I join with the Prime Minister and everyone across this House in sending my heartfelt condolences to Her Majesty the Queen on the death of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, and our thoughts and prayers are with Her Majesty and the whole royal family. There have been many tributes in recent days to Prince Philip, some from those who knew him well, some from those who'd barely met him, some from those who'd never met him, but whose lives he had touched. I had the privilege of meeting him and having a number of conversations with him. He was a truly remarkable man, a man of so many talents. We've heard some of them referred to already today. A distinguished naval officer, an inventor, an innovator, a designer, a painter, a sportsman, and so much else. What always struck me when he spoke, when I was having those conversations with him, was not just the incredible breadth of interests that he had, the wide range of interests he had, but the depth of knowledge that he had in each of those interests. He didn't just dip into a subject. He didn't pick something up because it was fashionable. He was deeply interested, he cared, and he understood the importance of getting to know the issues that he was involved in. He was indeed a man ahead of his time, particularly in the areas of the environment and conservation. But that wasn't a passing whim. He deeply loved the natural world. He understood nature, and he was passionate about wanting future generations to be able to enjoy and benefit from the natural world too. And I remember on my first visit as Prime Minister to Balmoral that Prince Philip drove myself and my husband around the estate and talked to us about the estate. It was as if he knew every single inch of it. He talked about the ancient Caledonian forest, about the birds, many of them protected, about the animals, about the plants on the estate, about the changes he'd seen over the years, and about what was needed in order to ensure that this environment could be protected and could be enjoyed by future generations. He was indeed a man ahead of his time. He showed again his deep knowledge, but he was also an immensely practical person. And he was a man of high standards. That did indeed come through his attention to detail in the cooking of the meat at the Balmoral barbecues. But I also remember an event which was hosted by the then Mayor of the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. It was a black tie event. Prince Philip was coming down from Windsor Castle for probably no more than half an hour. Now, some people would have said, well, you'll have to take me as you find me. I'll just turn up and I'm there and that's it. But he didn't. He dressed immaculately in black tie. He took the time and trouble because he had high standards, but also because he respected the event and the people who were there, and he wanted them to be at their ease. Now, I've mentioned Balmoral, and I remember my last stay at Balmoral, my husband and I, as everybody knows, enjoy walking, and we were able to do some walks there, and Prince Philip very kindly suggested a particular walk to us. So we were very grateful for this suggestion, and we set off. When we got back to the castle several hours later, we were told that Prince Philip did indeed enjoy this walk, but he normally drove round it in a car. I'm not sure if it was a test, and if it was, if we passed it, but I also remember on my last visit, when I went to say my farewell, and initially we couldn't find Prince Philip, and eventually I caught up with him, he was watching the cricket. How I would have loved to have stayed watching the cricket with him. Now, I, of course, am a Berkshire MP, and in Berkshire we feel a particular connection with the royal family, and Prince Philip set up the Prince Philip Trust Fund, which provides grants to individuals and causes in the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. And many of my constituents will have benefited from funding from that particular trust fund. And among the causes it focuses on are young people. And this is reflected, as others have said already, in the Duke of Edinburgh's awards. It is one of his particular legacies that he had this passion for enabling young people to find themselves, to challenge themselves, broaden their horizons, develop new skills, for some life-changing new skills. And millions across the world have much to be grateful to him for. But perhaps the most important aspect of his life was his absolute commitment to supporting Her Majesty the Queen. I know it is in no way comparable, but I know how important it is to have a husband, a partner who is a source of strength and a rock in time of trouble. As a hugely talented person, Prince Philip could have been enormously successful in his own right, but he put his life to ensuring the success of his wife. It was that willingness to put himself second and to serve, to understand the importance of duty and exercise it day in and day out, that will be his true lasting legacy, and which should be an inspiration to us all. And all of us here in the UK and across the Commonwealth have so much to be grateful to him for, and we say thank you. He understood the requirements of responsibility, the demands of duty, and the sacrifices of service. We will never see his like again. May he rest in peace and rise in glory.
We now turn to Mother of the House, the Right Honourable Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to add my tribute to the powerful speeches that have already been made to celebrate the life and role of the Duke of Edinburgh. For more than 70 years, he was at the heart of the royal family, that most historic and traditional of British institutions, yet has been said in many ways he was ahead of his time. He was ahead of his time on the environment. This year, the UK will host the 26th UN Climate Change Conference amidst the recognition here and globally of its importance. Yet more than 5 decades ago, Prince Philip was urging us with clarity and foresight to understand how all living creatures on this planet are interdependent, views which were so much ahead of their time that they were met by some with derision. He was ahead of his time on young people with the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, recognising the interconnection of physical and mental well-being as a route for young people to develop their full potential. And one of the many success stories of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards is the work that goes on at the Westminster House Youth Club in my constituency of Camberwell and Peckham. They get more black and minority ethnic young people through the awards than almost anyone else. Many of their young people have had a difficult start in life or have not thrived at school, and yet through the Duke of Edinburgh Awards find a route through to self-confidence and to success. And he was ahead of his time as a husband. One of the remarkable things about Prince Philip is that he chose, in his marriage, to put himself second and make his central role in life to support his wife in her role as the Queen. He sought never to eclipse her, only to support her. Now, way back, halfway through the last century, that was profoundly countercultural. The expectation was that to be a man was to be the head of the family, and that particularly when it comes to the public domain, It's the man who will play the leading role and the wife who will support him. And if that sadly still remains largely true today, how much more of an iron rule that was 70 years ago. So his decision to give up what would have been a glittering career in the Navy and make his duty to support his wife in her role took him into uncharted territory and left him exposed. For if he was not the head of the family, what did that make him? There was no reassuring recognition that he was no less of a man for what he did in putting her first and putting himself second. Of course, Mr. Speaker, it takes a remarkable man to be a leader, but it takes an even more remarkable man to support a woman leader, and that's what Prince Philip did. When we hear the Queen speak, we know that she always weighs her words carefully. And what she said at their golden wedding anniversary in 1997 was that Prince Philip had, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years. So what a loss it is for her to lose that husband, that partner, her liege man of life and limb. We're rightly paying tribute to his work on the environment, for young people, our armed forces, and much else besides. He did his work, but above all, he enabled the Queen to do hers, and for that he deserves our recognition and gratitude. He served this country by serving his Queen.
Sir Roger again.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful indeed to have this opportunity to place on the record, on behalf of my constituents in North Thanet, the huge appreciation that we all share for the life and the service of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And we'd also like, Mr. Speaker, to place on the record our condolences to Her Majesty the Queen and to all of the royal family, about which much has already been said. But the bottom line on this is that we are talking about a father and a grandfather and a great-grandfather, and most of all, of a devoted husband. It is inevitable on these occasions that there will be a degree of repetition. But I would like to come back to the award scheme to which the Duke of Edinburgh gave his name. At the weekend, I spoke with David Walker. David Walker, for 30 years, was the chairman of the Thanet award scheme. He received his Gold Award in 1966 at Holyrood from the Duke of Edinburgh himself. I also spoke with Stephen Dyke from East Kent. Stephen received his award this year, his Gold Award this year, by post, inevitably because of the circumstances that we face. And I said to Stephen, "Weren't you disappointed?" He said, "No. It didn't matter who gave it to me. What mattered was the achievement, the fact that I'd won the award." David and Stephen, generations apart, echo the thoughts and the sentiments of so many of my young constituents and those that colleagues in this House represent, who have been through the bronze, the silver and the gold. And to a man and a woman will all say, "It has changed my life." And Stephen said to me, "There is nothing that I feel that I now cannot achieve." I believe that we in this House owe it to the memory of the Duke of Edinburgh, who gave his name to the scheme, to ensure that it is not allowed to wither on the vine, but it goes forward and prospers and moves from strength to strength. It's already been said that the Duke of Edinburgh was way ahead of his time in his concern for wildlife and habitat. And that is absolutely true, and those of us, and there are many in this House on both sides, who take a keen interest in these issues now. I only wish we'd all been listening to him 50 years ago, because we might not then, now, be where we are. Mr. Speaker, you mentioned in your opening remarks the Duke's interest in ties. My wife reminded me at the weekend that when I was being introduced, his only comment was, "That's a very loud tie." And colleagues who know the tie of the Wooden Spoon Society will understand that he was absolutely right. I'd also like to finally place on record the thanks of the Parliament and Armed Forces Scheme for the very considerable interest that Prince Philip has taken in their work. And it was not so very long ago, Mr. Speaker, that you will remember that he found the time in your state apartments to make presentations to graduates of the scheme with typically robust language. He reminded us that provision for the future defence of the realm lies in our hands. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said he hoped that we would think of a fitting commemoration of this life. I can think of no finer tribute than naming the new royal yacht, the Duke of Edinburgh.
Mr. Speaker, Princess Anne said yesterday, "You know it's going to happen, but you're never really ready." This is a truth shared by so many grieving families. Most people know that their loved one is near the end of their life because they're old or very sick. But that doesn't mean that you can avoid the tidal wave of grief, that moment of finality. This year, than most others, so many families have faced this moment. So I'm sure the Princess Royal speaks not just for the Queen and the royal family, but for the whole country. You're never really ready. But, Mr. Speaker, as people grieve, we can also say thank you. Thank you to one of Britain's greatest public servants of the last 100 years. As other party leaders have said, Prince Philip has been a rock in the life of our nation since his betrothal to our Queen, then the young Princess Elizabeth. And above all, he has always been her rock. After 73 years of marriage, it will be our Queen who feels this loss far greater than anyone else. If anyone says that bereavement is easier when a loved one has lived a long life, I have to say that's not my experience. So, Ma'am, our hearts go out to you. Thankfully, there are so many wonderful memories to comfort the Queen and the nation. We've already heard of many of the Duke's contributions to our public life. I would mention his role as President of the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce for nearly 59 years. And it was there that he helped lead the major wave of British and global environmentalism and conservation, and where his commitment to British industry and design was remarkable. As the Prime Minister said, it is fitting that his coffin will be carried in a specially adapted Land Rover he himself designed. I only spoke to the Prince briefly on 2 occasions many years ago. Once when he came to my school, and once when I went to his palace at St. James's, as one of the millions of young people lucky enough to have taken part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. To be at the palace that day, I'd hiked round Kinder Scout, camped in Snowdonia, and got lost in the Cheviot. For the Gold Award, amongst much else, one has to learn a new skill. And when the Duke came to my group, he asked us what new skill we'd learnt. I told him proudly I had learnt to drive. So the Duke asked, with 4 or 6 horses? He pretended to be surprised when I said, "No, sir, a car." I've spoken to several people for my words today. Lady Ashdown, Jane, kindly shared her late great husband's experience of the Duke. As a former Royal Marine, Paddy bonded well with the longest ever serving Captain General of the Royal Marines. The Duke said no other politician had ever laid a wreath on Remembrance Sunday as well as Paddy did, with his Royal Marine heel click. Paddy also wrote in his memoirs about a state banquet for the King of Malaysia. After dinner, the Duke was touring the room and came to speak to Paddy. Well briefed as always, he asked Paddy why he had learnt Malay. Paddy writes, "I told him I'd been in the Commander Brigade in Singapore as a bachelor and had discovered that in Malay there was one word which meant, 'Let's take off our clothes and tell dirty stories.' So how could I resist learning Malay?" The Duke roared with laughter and followed up with some pretty salty jokes, including a very fruity one about wanting a pea in China. Much giggling. And a state banquet also features an anecdote from the former Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg. He recalls how he went to a state banquet for the Spanish King, not in his own right, but as the husband of Miriam González Dorantes. At the reception, Nick explained to the Duke he was merely accompanying Miriam. The Duke replied, "I know the feeling." There can be no doubt, for the Queen has said it herself, he was far more than a companion. He was a man who should be celebrated in his own right, for his courage, so evident in his war record, for his foresight, so marvellous in the championing of young people across the world, and in his determination to show real leadership on the environment. He was not, as he described himself, a discredited Balkan prince of no particular merit or distinction. He was special. A man who brought all his amazing European ancestry to the service of our country. Britain's special monarchy has been made more special thanks to Prince Philip. And as we thank him for his unique service, let us thank him above all for the wisdom, counsel, friendship and love he gave to our Queen.
Sir Ian Dumfries. Mr. Speaker, I rise to present my condolences to Her Majesty the Queen on the death of her liege man of life and limb, who was her husband, a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and a remarkable man. He was talented in his own right, as we have heard and read so much in the last few days. Many things, actually, that I suspect many of us had no idea that he did. I try to paint, and I understand what it is to be described as adequate. But I have to tell anybody that doesn't paint yet that they've something to discover, and that even getting the right colours in the right place at the right time is, as far as I'm concerned, brilliant. But to discover that he had all these elements and all these talents and did so many things, not just innovative, designing his own machinery, but just that intelligence, that drive, and that leadership. From the armed forces through hundreds of charities, so many thousands of public events, he added much distinction throughout. He did distinction to all that he did, even if it was telling business leaders to pull their fingers out when it was quite clear the UK needed business leaders that actually led and actually produced something that people wanted to buy. He was quick to spot that that was what was missing, not the people that were working in the businesses, but the people that were not leading them properly. And that was considered quite outrageous. But there was a huge, the thing that struck me, Mr. Speaker, has been the huge fondness that is, the outpourings of fondness that have come over the last few days. I didn't expect quite that level of fondness, because I thought by now, for many of new generations, they would not recognise some of the things that he had done or even understood. But their fondness and their sense, really, of who he was is quite interesting. And I think, in a way, Mr. Speaker, I would like to reflect on the fact that I think, in a way, there was something else that he represents. He represents the passing, finally, of the greatest generation. That generation that was prepared to sacrifice everything, so that the rest of us could live in peace and prosperity. They didn't ask any questions of what defined them so much, and I think defined him in a way, was this sense of duty, an obliging sense of service, no matter what the request was or command, that they were uncomplaining, or as the Duke of Edinburgh would say, they never bellyached, and they were always understated, never complained. My father's generation, you can hardly ever hear them say a word about what they went through. They just shrugged, never complained about their illnesses or their war wounds, and just got on with life. Well, he was very much a representative of that remarkable generation, as is, of course, Her Majesty the Queen. But the one area I wanted to remark on was that generation had this incredible sense of humour in the most difficult and appalling times. And I hope my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, doesn't mind if I relate one particular story, so typical of His Royal Highness, was that we were in the receiving line for civil service awards, and I was standing but one or two away from my right honourable friend when the Duke of Edinburgh arrived. Now, Her Majesty the Queen went through very calmly and quietly and shook everyone's hands and said a few words to them and moved on. He came through just behind her, and as he was getting to my right honourable friend, asking people what they did, he asked him, "What do you do?" And he boldly announced, this is some years ago, that he had just been put in charge of nuclear submarines. But, he said, smiling, "I don't know anything at all about them, Your Royal Highness." Whereupon he guffawed immediately and said, "How typical! Typical of politicians! In charge of something and not a single clue about it," he said, roared with laughter and walked on. Everybody else complete and utter silence. He asked me what I did, and I said, "Sir, nothing that important." And we moved on, which had the merit of being true. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, he was straight and very funny. And that's a key element to this. In this generation, I wonder what he thought about social media, where everybody complains or bellyaches the whole time about everything, about each other, often rudely and arrogantly, something that he would have considered, I think, in that generation, would have considered appalling. If you have nothing good to say about someone, then the old rule was, then don't say it. Of course, this will fly over our heads here, I suspect, quite happily. Can I therefore end, Mr. Speaker, by simply saying that the one thing, though, I think we must all remember, is that here was a man with a glittering potential career who chose, because of love, to take a pace behind the woman he loved and serve her. And by serving her, he served his country with distinction. Nothing else needed to be said. His departure is a loss for us all. But in the fact that we have such a great monarch, the reality is because we had a great man beside her. And for that, Mr. Speaker, I give thanks.
We're now going to our first virtual with Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a series of fulsome tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh this afternoon, and much has already been said about his extraordinary life and contribution to this country. But as someone who had the honour of serving as Lord Chancellor and then Lord President of the Council over a 4-year period, I particularly wanted to say a few words on this very sad occasion, and in particular to convey my deep condolences to Her Majesty the Queen and to the whole of the royal family. I think listening to the debate this afternoon, few would disagree that the reign of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has been the most distinguished in the history of the monarchy in this country. She's not just a much-loved figurehead for our nation. She's respected around the world. She continues to be a remarkable figure as head of state of this country and many other countries around the Commonwealth, and of course as head of the Commonwealth itself. But it's absolutely not, in my view, an exaggeration to say that she could not have done everything that she has without the tireless support of the Duke of Edinburgh through the nearly 70 years of her reign. Through all of those years, he's been at her side and helped her give the country the leadership that's been so valuable to us all. And as my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford Woodford Green, has just said, that duty came with personal sacrifice. He was a very distinguished defender of this country in the Second World War. He did some extraordinary things during that conflict. But then he gave up a promising career and the potential for high rank, possibly the highest rank in the Navy, to follow her in her role both here and abroad. And he did so with a sense of service to this country that few could match. And that sense of duty ran well after most people had long retired. I remember him taking the time to visit my constituency to open a new building when he was in his 80s. And as he strode around the building, and he did stride around the building, I remember remarking to his equerry how impressive and extraordinary it was that he was still doing so much for the country at that age. He's a lesson to us all, was the reply, and indeed he was. And of course that visit was nearly 20 years ago, and for most of the years since then, he just carried on with the same work he'd been doing for most of his lifetime, only retiring at the age of 96. Mr. Speaker, I don't suppose many of us will be able to match that. And away from public duties, he was a charming and engaging man. I remember as a cabinet minister attending a dinner at one of the livery companies as their guest for the evening, being a little surprised to find the Duke around the table as well, clearly outranking me. And it turned out he wasn't a guest at all, but actually he was one of the members and a regular attender at the dinners there. And he was lively, great company as well. Not, of course, to mention that well-known and sharpest of wit. For me, Mr. Speaker, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh have been a national team for the United Kingdom for as long as I can remember, and it is going to be very strange without him. So this is a very sad time for our country. We've lost somebody who's been a central part of our national life for most of our lifetimes. But for the royal family, this is much more. They've lost a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. And so my simple final message today is to Her Majesty the Queen and to her family. What I want to say is this, and I imagine, Mr. Speaker, it's on behalf of all of us in this House. We all feel deep sorrow about your loss. We're all thinking of you, and we're all sending you our best wishes on what is really a sad occasion for our whole country.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party and the people in Northern Ireland that we have the privilege to represent, may I convey our sincere sympathy to Her Majesty the Queen and to the entire royal family on the sad passing of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, a devoted husband and much-loved father, grandfather and great-grandfather, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, a father figure for our nation. We uphold them all at this time in our prayers. During his lifetime, the Prince made over 50 visits to Northern Ireland, and on many of these occasions he stayed at Hillsborough Castle in my constituency. Of course, this is the home of the royal family in our part of the United Kingdom, and the royal family is always welcome in Hillsborough. And the people of the village and their neighbours throughout and across the Lagan Valley constituency share in our sense of loss at this time. Prince Philip was very fond of Hillsborough, and especially the beautiful gardens of Hillsborough Castle. His memory will live long within our local community and those who had the privilege to meet him. Mr. Speaker, Ulster people prefer plain speaking. And in Prince Philip they found someone, a man, who was reassuring in his honesty and in his passion for ensuring that our young people in particular had the best opportunity to enjoy a meaningful and purposeful life. He recognised that when you invest in young people, you invest in the future. And the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme has been referred to by the Prime Minister and by many colleagues across the House. In Northern Ireland, young people from right across the community, from all parts of that community, took part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. And I know that he took great pride in the fact that The young people in that scheme came from all kinds of backgrounds in Northern Ireland. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in the last year alone, over 6,000 young people in Northern Ireland have started their programme in the Duke of Edinburgh's awards scheme, and over 3,000 have completed their awards. Many young lives shaped and influenced by that scheme, by the attributes that the Duke inculcated into the scheme. Young people who in Northern Ireland are the leaders of the future. And we thank His Royal Highness for his investment in their future. Mr. Speaker, we also salute the Duke's service to our country, his service with and support for our armed forces. He served with courage and distinction and was an inspiration to many, not least our veterans, with whom he identified so closely. In her annual message, Her Majesty the Queen refers often to the importance of her Christian faith in dealing with the challenges that all of us face in life. And losing a loved one is one of the greatest challenges. Mr. Speaker, it is our prayer that in these days of mourning and in the times ahead, Her Majesty and indeed the royal family as a whole will be able to draw upon this deep well of faith, and that it will bring comfort and sustain them, and especially Her Majesty as she continues her journey of service to this nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and to the Commonwealth of Nations and to the overseas territories. She will continue that journey without the support of her much-loved companion, Prince Philip. As a nation, we will miss him. In Northern Ireland, we salute his memory.
We now go virtually to Andrew Slew. Andrew.
As we meet to pay our respect to His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, our thoughts and prayers are with Her Majesty the Queen, her children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who are experiencing such a profound loss from one of the twin pillars of their family's life. But it is a loss for all of us as well. The Duke of York put it well over the weekend when he said, "We have lost the grandfather of the nation." My brother said to me over the weekend, "I will miss Prince Philip a lot. I have grown up with him. He has always been the quiet, strong presence at the Queen's side, and I think that feeling is very widely shared." Although born into a life of privilege and later living such a life, we must remember that he arrived on our shores as a homeless refugee, and in the proud tradition of these islands, we gave him welcome, and he repaid that welcome 1,000 times over with a life of unstinting service to our country, the Commonwealth, and the world. He was a man of many interests, but he will be remembered principally for the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. And I noticed the comments of one young man last Friday who said that had it not been for the award scheme, he suspected he would have ended up in prison. And like so many families, my own children benefited from the scheme, which I'm sure will continue to go from strength to strength, a living memorial to Prince Philip. His other great interests of conservation and the environment fitted so well with his service to young people. It is, of course, young people who will reap the benefits of a planet and creation that is well cared for, and it is they who will feel most keenly its loss. The Duke was way ahead of his time in realising the profound danger of climate change and biodiversity loss. In terms of being a role model, he showed how men can serve women while being men in their own right. And never have such role models like this been needed more as we continue to learn of unacceptable behaviour by men towards women. In 2017, he visited my constituency with the Queen to open the Elephant Care Centre at Whipsnade Zoo, and then to open Priory View Independent Living Scheme in Dunstable. And as Councillor Carol Hegley, portfolio holder for adult social care at Central Bedfordshire Council, who showed him round, said of him, "I saw his warm and friendly manner, his unique humour, and the way that he made people feel at ease, talking to many guests as he toured the building. At the end of the visit, he received a gift from the oldest resident at Priory View, who was a good few years younger than the Duke himself. As the royal family are united in their grief, I hope they will grow closer together and cherish each other even more, having lost one of their most beloved members. His marriage to the Queen was built on deep love and a shared Christian faith, which, as we have heard from many bishops and clergy, was living and real. And it is for that reason that we can ask with confidence that he rest in peace and rise in glory. He had an assurance that death was not the end, and it is the Queen and her family that we must continue to support in their grief.
We now go to the Right Honourable Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join speakers from across the House and from across the country in paying tributes and respects to His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and also conveying heartfelt sympathies and condolences from all our constituents, from people across Normanton, Pontefract, Castleford and Nottingley, to Her Majesty the Queen, and to all the royal family, to all Prince Philip's friends and family who are grieving now. His has been a remarkable life through a remarkable century, as many have said, from royal to refugee to royal once more, a naval officer while the world was at war, a champion of science, industry and the environment in the peace, and always a public servant. And every one of us across the country, whether we had ever met him or not, could not fail to see the steadfast sense of duty, commitment and devotion that he showed to the Queen and also to our country, the marriage and partnership that endured through those 7 remarkable decades. The role of the monarch, even one as well loved and respected as our Queen truly is, can still so easily become a lonely one. And yet, for so many decades, Prince Philip has provided that steadfast support and devotion and comfort that has supported our Queen and our country owes him thanks. And the great age in which Prince Philip remarkably kept working well into his 90s is astonishing. Just 6 years ago, already well into his 90s, he came to the opening of West Yorkshire Police's new training centre at Carr Lane in Wakefield and described himself then as the world's most experienced plaque opener. He wasn't wrong. And millions of people will remember him, not for those royal visits, many as they were, but for the adventures he led them through in the Duke of Edinburgh ward. On a miserable, wet Friday evening close to Easter, somewhere in the middle of the 1980s and somewhere in the middle of nowhere, like millions of other teenagers before or since, I climbed out of a school minibus to set off across a muddy field in bucketing rain. And our sleeping bags were soggy by the time we arrived at our campsite, and it poured all night. But the sun shone in the morning and we loved it. And the fact that so many millions of young people across the country and across the generations have done the same thing in the Duke of Edinburgh's name shows how it has stood the strength of time. The expeditions that instilled the teamwork, leadership and resilience, the chance to learn new skills, the encouragement of physical activity, the responsibility to take up volunteering and to do your duty to others, those elements were the things that he himself loved and believed in as ways to build young people's confidence and opportunities. So subsequent governments talked often of and tried to set up versions of national citizen services for young people. But it was the Duke of Edinburgh back in the 1950s who actually set one up that has endured, and one that's reached out. That a quarter of the young people who started the scheme last year faced some kind of financial hardship or needed support. The fact that so many young people from all corners of the country have had the chance to take part. Students in Normanton, Pontefract, Castleford and Nottingley today. And experiences that New College Pontefract students have described as bringing them great pride and teaching them about dedication, hard work, and the way it builds confidence. Prince Philip has resisted the Duke of Edinburgh scheme being seen as his legacy. No, he said, it's there for people to use. And yet it feels more important, with more potential and significance now on its passing, even than it did over 60 years ago. When young people have had such a tough time this year, when they've too often been held back or been stuck inside or been unable to reach out or spread their wings, now is when the Duke of Edinburgh scheme feels more apt than ever. It is a great legacy, and we now must make sure it keeps reaching more and more young people so he can keep reaching new generations, just as Prince Philip did for all of us.
Let us go across to the Right Honourable Maria Miller. Maria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to send deepest condolences on behalf of myself and my constituents here in Basingstoke to Her Majesty the Queen on the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, and to send deepest sympathy to the whole of the royal family. The Duke of Edinburgh's life was a life of public service through his military service, through his patronage of hundreds of charities and community organisations, and of course in his very, very clear service over more than 7 decades in support of Her Majesty the Queen. His Royal Highness was quite simply part of all our lives over the past 7 decades. He has been someone who's led by example in his commitment to public service, to our communities, to those hundreds of charities and community organisations. And I think it's that genuine passion and commitment to our country, to our communities and to our charities that are so important to us, that starts to explain the depth of feeling we've seen expressed throughout the United Kingdom following his death on Friday. And that serious commitment was, however, I think, Mr. Speaker, coupled with a serious sense of humour, something that we've heard about in earlier tributes today. And I had a small insight into that when I met His Royal Highness on a more informal occasions, particularly when my daughter and I met Prince Philip a few years ago at a Buckingham Palace garden party. Now, my daughter had just taken her A-levels, and after vigorously shaking our hands, Prince Philip made it very clear that he was incredulous that any 18-year-old would want to spend their time meeting a pensioner rather than being off travelling in the Far East. Typically self-deprecating, typically putting everyone at their ease. Here in Hampshire, tributes have been led by both our Lord Lieutenant Nigel Atkins and also in Basingstoke by our Mayor Diane Taylor. And our flags are flown at half-mast, our floral tributes have been laid, and very heartfelt tributes made to the contribution that Prince Philip has made over so many years. And indeed, memories of his visits to Hampshire, particularly when he opened the Milestones Museum in Basingstoke Town. But of course, His Royal Highness will be best remembered for launching the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme back in 1956 to help young people develop skills and resilience that they need to succeed in life. And over the last 65 years, more than 6 million young people have completed this award. And I think as we look forward, what better way to commemorate his life and cement that legacy rather than to continue to commit to support an expansion of youth work and extracurricular activities for all young people. And I think particularly following the last year and the effect that the pandemic has had on so many young people. Now, there'll be time for us to develop that thinking more as we look to the future and how the Duke of Edinburgh scheme and other youth organisations can cement that passion and commitment that he had in support of young people. But at this time, I think we need to salute Prince Philip's service to our country. He will be missed, but his legacy will certainly go on. Thank you.
Let us go to Right Honourable Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. I wish to speak on behalf of Plaid Cymru in Westminster and to express my party's condolences to the Queen Elizabeth, and her family at the death of Prince Philip, and to share their sadness following the death of a husband, a father, a grandfather and a great-grandfather. Sorrow at the close of such constancy and stability resonates across families, communities and nations during this time of great loss. There are many people in Wales who would desire that I convey their sorrow and their sympathy today. Among the Duke of Edinburgh's titles was Earl of Meirionnydd, which is now inherited by his eldest son. The Queen wears a wedding band made of gold from the Clogau St David's mine above Bont Ddu, near Dolgella in Meirionnydd. Prince Philip was stationed as an instructor of naval ratings at HMS Glendower near Pwllheli during the Second World War. The Navy camp became one of Billy Butlin's holiday camps after the war, which the Duke and the Queen toured in an open-top Land Rover during a later visit. I too would like to mention particularly the Duke of Edinburgh's contribution to the promotion of outdoor education for young people, and how he was influenced by the pioneering educator, Kurt Hahn, initially during the Prince's own schooling at Gordonstoun in Scotland, and then with the establishment of the first Outward Bound Centre in Aberdyfi, Meirionnydd in 1941. This led in turn to the principles that continue to underpin the Duke of Edinburgh's awards and which have enriched the lives of millions of young people. These four pillars of principles are physical fitness, craftsmanship, self-reliance and compassion, and they are reflected in Wales's educational initiatives, from the International Baccalaureate at Atlantic College to the principles which inform the nation's public curriculum. To close, I'd like to say in Welsh, pob cydymdeimlad a'r teulu brenhinol yn ei galar, ac a phob teulu sy'n galaru am anwyliad eleni. Boed iddyn nhw oll, hino, ma'n perffaith hedd. Thank you very much.
Let us go to the Right Honourable Mel Stride. Mel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's tributes have demonstrated that there are few who have lived a life as full as that of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. There are even fewer who have dedicated their life to the service of our country with such resolution and unwavering commitment. His was a long life that saw early service in the Navy in the Second World War, where he served with distinction within both the Mediterranean and Pacific fleets. But before that, he graduated as best in class as a naval cadet at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, something of which we in Devon are particularly proud. There could surely be few as active as he in the support of both community and country. He was a patron, president or member of over 800 organisations, and he made over 22,000 solo engagements during the reign of Her Majesty the Queen. It was not until the age of 96 that he retired from royal duties. He truly did fill Kipling's unforgiving minute with 60 seconds of distance run. He will be especially remembered for championing the environment and, of course, as we have heard, for the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, in which every year hundreds of thousands take part, including many young people in my own constituency, to develop their skills and mature into more confident, capable and caring people, to give them, as he termed it, a sense of responsibility to themselves and their communities. In my constituency, Mr. Speaker, the Duke of Edinburgh Awards are offered at all three of my secondary schools and embraced with vigour, with around 100 students at the Queen Elizabeth School in Crediton alone completing an award in a typical year. And Dartmoor, which lies at the heart of my constituency, has been the beautiful place of challenge where so many people from all over our country and from a huge diversity of backgrounds have embraced the Duke of Edinburgh's dream. And the millions of young people up and down the United Kingdom and across the 140 countries around the world have much to thank him for. He changed lives, and that is a legacy of which to be especially proud. But, Mr. Speaker, above all, our thoughts must be with Her Majesty the Queen and her family. Over 70 years of marriage, the longest-serving British royal consort in our history, a long life as a supportive husband to Queen Elizabeth, now leaves what must be a terribly painful void. Our thoughts are with the Queen and all of her family, and the thoughts of my family, of Michelle, Natasha, Ophelia and Evelyn, are with her too. May the Duke of Edinburgh rest in peace.
Let us go across the Right Honourable Hilary Benn. Hilary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must confess that, like many people, there are things I have learned in the last few days about the life of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, that I did not previously know. The difficult circumstances of his early life, his mother's bravery in hiding a Jewish family from the Germans in Greece during the war, for which she is remembered at Yad Vashem as one of the righteous amongst the nations. And just how deep and long-standing was his personal commitment to wildlife and to nature conservation, in many ways, as others have said, ahead of its time. We were all aware, however, that the Duke of Edinburgh was famous for his plain speaking. I particularly enjoyed the story that when he discovered that the Parliament of Ghana only had 200 members, he quipped, I trust with a smile on his face, that's about the right number. We have 650 and most of them are a complete bloody waste of time. Now, how one would describe that or any of his other more famous comments, he certainly said what he thought, requires us, I think, to understand from whence they and he came. For over 70 years of public service, in which he carried out with distinction the role of the first consort, a job without a description, he went into countless rooms and was introduced to countless lines of people, all of whom were waiting for him to say something. Which one of us would be able to do that for over 7 decades without on occasion saying something that we might later come to regret, or in the Duke's case, probably not? He was, as are we all, a product of the age in which he was born and of his upbringing. When the Duke was born in 1921, Queen Victoria had died only 20 years previously, and Lloyd George was Prime Minister. It was another era, and as we today sometimes wrestle with our past and how we should come to terms with it, we cannot forget that fundamental truth about how each one of us is shaped, nor can we truly understand a person without also understanding the age in which they lived, as the Duke of Edinburgh always sought to do. And he lived for a very long time. Even if we did not know all that he was doing, he was ever present in our lives as he was that constant strength to Her Majesty the Queen. And as we have watched the tributes and the newsreels about his life, inevitably we have reflected upon our own lives, what has changed and what that has meant as we ourselves have got older. This is, after all, the human condition. And as the American baseball player Satchel Paige wisely observed, age is a case of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And I suspect that the Duke would have agreed with that sentiment. Mr. Speaker, as we all express our condolences to Her Majesty the Queen and the royal family on their loss, we should also remember that the passing of a public figure is for the family that loved him also a deeply felt private loss. There is the public mourning, but there is also the private grief, which is very personal, and it can be difficult to endure that amid all the public attention. However, of one thing we can be sure. All of the comments, all of the recollections, all of the stories that have been told about the Duke of Edinburgh in the past few days will surely be a great comfort to the royal family, as they would be to anyone who has lost a loved one. And oh, how many of our citizens have experienced such a loss in the last year. Why? Because when someone close to us dies, to know that their life was well lived, to know that it had meaning, and to know that they will be remembered is perhaps the greatest comfort of all. May he rest in peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I found it very moving to hear the tributes to His Royal Highness flooding in from people around the country, the Commonwealth and the whole world. and I join them and everyone in this House today in offering my sincerest condolences and sympathies to Her Majesty the Queen and her family at this difficult time. Clearly, our nation owes the Duke a great debt of gratitude for his bravery defending our freedom during the war and for his dedicated public service over 7 decades. He has played a central role in ensuring the monarchy adapted to the modern era and that it remains a well-loved institution at the heart of our national life. I had the honour to meet His Royal Highness on a number of occasions. That includes the 2014 and 2016 visits to Northern Ireland that he undertook with Her Majesty the Queen during the period when I was Secretary of State there. So he was well into his 90s by the time I met him, and what always struck me was the incredible energy and enthusiasm with which he approached everything he did. It is quite phenomenal that he only chose to retire at 96. He was always courteous and friendly, and the light-hearted remarks I think we've heard so much about over the last few days, I think they were always intended to put people at their ease. And he always expressed a genuine and well-informed interest in Northern Ireland and its future. The BBC have calculated that the Duke made 57 visits to Northern Ireland, and I especially remember his role in the 2014 visit, which broke new ground in the places visited and the proximity to the public. I recall him solicitously at the Queen's side, for example, as we visited St George's Market in Belfast. Now, this market is right up close to many locations which saw more of their fair share of violence during Northern Ireland's long years of tragedy. And yet the biggest security scares that day were a Belfast teenager sneaking a quick selfie with Her Majesty and losing Prince Philip in the crowd as he mingled happily with those who turned out to greet the royal couple. There was clearly never any lack of spontaneity and unpredictability when it came to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. And he was, of course, a crucial part of the Queen's historic state visit to Ireland in 2011. He was an individual who suffered deep personal loss at the hands of the IRA when they murdered his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, to whom he was very close. And today, as well as all his many other achievements, we should remember the part the Duke played in reconciliation in Northern Ireland. After such a devastating loss, it cannot have been easy to meet and shake hands with Martin McGuinness. But that is what he and Her Majesty chose to do. What's more, during the state visit of President Higgins, they welcomed Martin McGuinness into their home at Windsor, someone identified with the organisation at whose hands they had suffered such a terrible loss. And in so doing, I believe they played a personal role in helping take Northern Ireland forward from its divided past to a better future. And for that, we should all express our sincere gratitude to the man whose loss we are sadly mourning today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm incredibly grateful for you giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of my constituents in Edinburgh South in tribute and condolence this afternoon. As has been said already in the House and will be repeated, no doubt, throughout these tributes and for months and years to come, on Friday we lost an extraordinary public servant who dedicated his long life to our country, transformed the lives of millions of young people across the world, and promoted the issue of global conservation well before it was widely understood by the vast majority of the population. For more than 7 decades, he was a constant at the Queen's side. We know from all that's been said and written how much the Queen cherished the support, counsel and love of her husband. Prince Philip, of course, had a long association with Scotland, which dates back to his school days at Gordonston in the mid-1930s. But it's in my city, the city of his title, Edinburgh, that I'd like to say a few words in tribute this afternoon. He was the patron of around 30 charities and educational institutions based in Edinburgh alone, not to mention the many thousands across the whole of the country that we've heard about already today. Heriot-Watt University, the Royal College of Surgeons, the University of Edinburgh Graduates Association, the Botanical Society of Scotland. He was patron and a freeman of Edinburgh itself. Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce and Enterprise, the Edinburgh Indian Association, the Edinburgh Press Club, of course, the Edinburgh Royal Navy Club. How could it not be? His beloved Royal Yacht Britannia, of course, the yacht that he helped to design, is retired in Leith in Edinburgh. He's a friend of the Royal Scottish Academy of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture, the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers, a patron of the National Galleries of Scotland, the Rotary Club of Edinburgh, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh Athletic Club, and of course he was Chancellor of the Edinburgh University for nearly 60 years from the 1950s, a position that he accepted with the joke that, and I quote, "only a Scotsman could survive Scottish education." I'm not sure if that was born of his experience at Gordonston, Mr. Speaker. He was heavily involved in all aspects of the university. He would preside over special graduation ceremonies, he would help induct new professors, he attended long service awards for senior staff, he would attend the installation of the rector by students, he enjoyed the uproar of the rector's ceremony and complained to former Professor O'Shea that he had made the event too orderly. He partook in the granting of fellowships to postgraduate students at the University of Edinburgh undertaking advanced and complex research. However, he never shied away from engaging with the students on their complicated topics, everything from particle physics to Dolly the sheep. And in fact, one recipient said afterwards, "I feel I've just been put through another exam, except it was much harder than the last one." He had an official Edinburgh colour, Edinburgh green, which his team wore and lined his private car. And of course his own official standard, featuring lions in the hearts of Denmark, a white cross in blue for Greece, 2 black pales on white for the Mountbatten family, and the coat of arms of the City of Edinburgh. We've heard much this afternoon about the founding of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards in 1956 that he chaired until his 80th birthday. He regularly attended the gold ceremonies hosted at Holyrood House in Edinburgh. For many young people, those awards were the closest they would get to traditional high school graduation. So the Duke of Edinburgh always took the time to individually speak to as many of the awardees as he could. It's a scheme that transformed the life chances of young people across the world, from the Prince's own school at Gordonston all the way to the school that I attended in Edinburgh. Many will recall anecdotes of his sharp wit and humour. Everyone who's paid tribute since Friday has talked of him as a funny, engaging, warm and loving man. He once joked while getting stuck in a lift during a visit to Edinburgh's Heriot-Watt University that this could only happen at a technical college. He was not just the Duke of Edinburgh, Mr. Speaker, in name, but the Duke of Edinburgh in his actions and public service too. His legacy to the UK, the Commonwealth, overseas territories and the wider world will be celebrated and will live on for many generations. His contribution to my city, Edinburgh, will be unmatched. Mr. Speaker, losing a loved one is always so hard. I lost my own father when he was just 39. His grandchildren will only know him by the stories that we tell and the anecdotes that we recall. But it doesn't matter if you are 39 or 99, a Duke or a Cooper, the hurt and loss to those loved ones and friends never diminishes. So on behalf of my constituents in Edinburgh South and the city of his title, we send our heartfelt condolences and thoughts to Her Majesty the Queen, his close and extended family, and all that will miss him so much.
Let us go to Douglas Ross. Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and on behalf of the people of Murray, could I extend my deepest condolences to Her Majesty the Queen and the entire royal family. We've just heard from the Honourable Gentleman for Edinburgh South speaking about the city of the Duke of Edinburgh's title. If I could now comment about Murray and the home of his school, Gordonston, just outside the village of Duffus. The Duke of Edinburgh was one of the first pupils at Gordonston School in 1934, and over the weekend I spoke to the current principal, Lisa Kerr, who shared a number of remarks about his time there. It was at Gordonston that the Duke of Edinburgh developed his lifelong love of Scotland, of the sea, of the outdoors and of sport. And he took various positions in the school during his career there, culminating in becoming the guardian or head boy in his final term, a role of which he was, to quote the school, universally trusted, liked and respected. On his engagement to Princess Elizabeth in 1947, Gordonston's founder, Kurt Hahn, wrote, "The Prince enjoyed life, his laughter was heard everywhere, and he created merriness around him." Clearly traits that he continued throughout his many decades of public service. But many honourable and right honourable members today have spoken about the Duke of Edinburgh Award. And of course it also started in Murray, Kurt Hahn founded the Murray Badge, which was the precursor to the Duke of Edinburgh Award. And it was in the Duke of Edinburgh's final year, in the autumn of 1938, at Gordonstoun, that he was awarded the Senior Silver Murray Badge. In 1954, Kurt Hahn looked to take the award to a national level, and he consulted with Prince Philip and persuaded him to give his name to what became the Duke of Edinburgh Award in 1956. That award has now supported and helped millions of young people, not just here in the United Kingdom, but is spread to over 140 countries. Young people right across the world have benefited from their participation in the Duke of Edinburgh Award, and it is a fitting and lasting legacy. I'd also like to share comments made by our Lord Lieutenant, the Major General Seymour Monro. He said over the weekend of Prince Philip, he gave leadership to so many, whether it was the young, whether it was encouraging technology and enterprise and business, or encouraging sporting activities and events. However, above all, it will be as the Queen's enduring, loyal and supportive consort that he will be remembered. Today we remember a life well lived, a life of dedicated service to his Queen and country. We extend our sympathies to the Queen and the entire royal family as they mourn the loss of a loving husband of more than 70 years and a caring father, grandfather and great-grandfather. Prince Philip held a special place for Scotland both from his younger years and his many travels there, both on holiday at Balmoral or visiting so many good causes and charities right across the country. So today, as a nation, we also mourn the loss of a great public servant who for more than 70 decades did so much for Scotland and the entire United Kingdom. And we join in the royal family's mourning of their loss of a true champion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
20 is withdrawn, so we go to the Right Honourable Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Everything that wasn't invented by God was invented by an engineer. So said Prince Philip with characteristic economy. And as Chairman of the Science and Technology Committee of this House, I'd just like to say a few words in addition to those that you made, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister, the Father of the House, and other members, and pay in particular tribute to the characteristically energetic and galvanising role that the Duke played as a champion of science, and in particular in its application in technology and engineering. As the Prime Minister alluded to, there is of course form for the consort of a long-serving and brilliant Queen to choose science and technology for encouragement and action. Indeed, one of Prince Philip's first public speeches was in 1951, the centenary year of the Great Exhibition, explicitly a speech that drew on Prince Albert's example. Appointed, like the Prince Consort, as President of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, he devoted his inaugural address to a clear-sighted and candid analysis of the need to improve on the need to translate scientific discovery into industrial application, noting, and I quote, a conservative attitude to technological change that he detected in the country. And I quote, existing institutions do not produce anything like enough trained technologists to meet the urgent needs of scientific development in industry. Now, Mr. Speaker, this was not merely a critique, but an agenda. Having become President of the Council of Engineering Institutions, the 12 societies that made up the then fragmented British engineering profession, he wanted there to be a clear path for engineers, whatever their specialism, to reach professional status. This was achieved by the formation of the Engineers Registration Board and the creation of different professional levels, including Chartered Engineer. And Prince Philip was concerned that the prestige of engineering was not high enough. And through what we now call soft power, helped by the scientifically unexplained effect of dinners at Buckingham Palace, the Prince prevailed with his own vision for a Fellowship of Engineering, which had its inaugural meeting in the throne room at Buckingham Palace in 1976. And in 1992, it became the Royal Academy of Engineering, with the Duke as its senior fellow, and a very active one at that. The Prince was not just the Senior Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, but as we've heard in this debate, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Chancellor of many universities and indeed polytechnics and colleges. Members of my committee and others in this House know that the work of translating scientific discovery into practice, in enhancing the prestige of technology and engineering, and improving technical education, are matters that occupied not just Prince Albert and Prince Philip, but all of us today. But we recognise and celebrate the decisive practical achievements that the Duke of Edinburgh made, helping match the strength of a fragmented and too little recognised profession. As Lord Brown of Madingley, the former president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, said, Prince Philip helped save engineering in the UK, ensuring that it not merely has a great history, but a great future too. Mr. Speaker, we give thanks for that lifetime of work.
Let us go to Dame Diana Johnson, the Right Honourable. Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm speaking this afternoon on behalf of my Hull parliamentary neighbours, my honourable friend for Hull East and my honourable friend for Hull West and Hessel, and for all our constituents in expressing our deep condolences to the Queen and the royal family at this very sad time. It's also right to note that the royal family are first and foremost a family, grieving their loss, and sadly are like so many other families in the United Kingdom who have suffered loss and bereavement this past year and are grieving at this time too. But today we remember a long life, so well lived, and a man who devoted himself to public service. The Duke of Edinburgh had an active and inquiring mind, a sense of humour and a willingness to speak his mind, and a strong sense of duty to his Queen and country. It is impossible in a few minutes to do justice to all the causes and interests that he gave so much to for so long, including supporting our armed forces, establishing the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, which so many young people in Hull have participated in, or pioneering wildlife and nature conservation. And with Hull being a maritime city, I know the Duke of Edinburgh had a long association with Hull Trinity House, and for some years would attend their Christmas luncheons. I also remember very well when he last visited the city of Hull in 2009 with Her Majesty the Queen. But what I want to focus on for a moment is that along with Her Majesty the Queen, Prince Philip was a prominent member of what has become known as that greatest generation. He played his part in fighting for our country's survival, the liberation of Europe from Nazi enslavement and its rebuilding after the war. And I have the huge privilege of serving on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and I know that veterans from all over the Commonwealth will mourn the Duke's passing. And for me, some of the most moving footage shown over the weekend was the Duke marching amongst the ranks of fellow war veterans, saluting his Queen. Now, there is a public debate on ideas for remembering the Duke, and whatever is agreed, I hope that it supports British skills and jobs and provides opportunities for our young people. But I just have a suggestion too. The first ever ship on which Prince Philip, then only 18, served as a midshipman was HMS Ramillies. This was one of the historic Royal Navy ships that eventually took part in Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, and one of its guns stands outside the Imperial War Museum today. In the programme of new Royal Navy ships, it seems fitting to me that in remembering Prince Philip, we should restore the name of HMS Ramillies to one of our future ships. Rest in peace. Thank you.
We now go to Sir William Cash. Sir William.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April the 9th, when I heard the sad news, I walked to the small Norman church, St Michael's, next to our home at Upton Cresset, and tolled the Hanover bell 99 times. The bell was hung in 1701 to commemorate the Hanoverian succession, negotiated by the ambassador to Hanover, James Cresset, and the Act of Settlement, which took place that year. Directly below the bell stands the Norman font, which Prince Philip arranged to be transferred to Gordonston in the 1960s for safekeeping. as the church and the house were then derelict. The bell is now returned. This was typical of his spiritual sense. We hear he had more books on religion than any other subject. Our prayers and thoughts, therefore, are with the Queen and the royal family, and those of my constituents of Stone join with me in their private grief. I had the privilege of conversing with Prince Philip occasionally, including on the environment. At a garden party, I introduced him to Margaret Thatcher's advisor on the subject. "Aha," he said, "so your party is now on my bandwagon, is it?" I replied, "We've been on it since Disraeli," and we had a good laugh. Another time, at St George's House in Windsor, we touched on the subject of Europe, which was also very illuminating. Last week, we heard much new about Prince Philip, bringing his long and distinguished life of service into new focus. He was a polymath, a pathfinder with a purpose, with a sharp wit and much laughter. His values were both traditional and modern. He lived a life of duty, self-reliance, selflessness without self-pity and self-effacing. He did not do political correctness. He used his role for the good of mankind, and his award scheme helped millions of young people to achieve their potential in this country, across the Commonwealth and throughout the world, from every walk of life, every faith and every race. He was a good man doing good things, a brave man in the Navy and in the war. He was as talented as he was learned. Curious beyond words, applying his knowledge of science, technology and engineering, and insisting on its practical implementation. In the words of Shakespeare, Prince Philip would have said, "I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life, but for my single self, I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as I myself." He was his own man and a man of his own time. He was a consummate competitive sportsman with rugged determination at the reins of his carriage or on the polo field, and he loved to win. He was head of his school and captain of cricket, and later president of the MCC. Young people needed playing fields, and he ensured they had them. The film recordings of his life with the Queen show the mutual and sheer love and laughter expressed in their eyes when they were together for those wonderful 73 years. I remember watching the wedding on television, a golden moment in 1947 after 6 years of war and deep austerity. Prince Charles, on Easter Sunday, shortly before Prince Philip peacefully passed away, read Gerald Manley Hopkins' ecstatic poem, God's Grandeur, for the Easter meditation at Stonyhurst, my old school. It opens with the words which so well express his father's spirituality and his commitment to the world around us. The words are, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." It goes on to say, "Nature is never spent." As you know so well, Mr. Speaker, Stonyhurst is in the Ribble Valley, which inspired Hopkins, and we are told that Her Majesty and Prince Philip have long and greatly loved that area. Hopkins taught at Stonyhurst, where he wrote exquisite poetry about Ribblesdale and the River Hodder by Whitewell, including his poem of 1882, which begins, "As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame." This literally is at the heart of our country, as was Prince Philip himself. He was a man for all seasons and for all mankind. We thank him and may he rest in peace.
We now go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my party, the Green Party of England and Wales, I'd like to join members from across the House in paying tribute to His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, and in expressing my deepest condolences to Her Majesty the Queen at this very sad and difficult time. And while this is a key moment for the life of the country, first and foremost, it's a deeply personal one for the Duke's family, and in particular for the Queen. The last year has highlighted the importance of family like never before, and I'm sure the death of Prince Philip has resonated even more strongly with many other families up and down the country who are also mourning the loss of loved ones. So much has been said already about the Duke's long life of public service, his vision in creating the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, the pioneering role he played in global interfaith developments, his internationalism and global outlook. But perhaps unsurprisingly, it's on his advocacy for nature and wildlife that I would like to focus. The Duke was a champion of the early environmental movement long before it was fashionable, recognising that, and I quote, "We depend on being part of the web of life. We depend on every other living thing on this planet." He acknowledged what he called a moral duty to protect those other species, saying, "If we as humans have got this power of life and death, not just life and death, but extinction and survival, we ought to exercise it with some sort of moral sense." Ever practical, he took those insights and translated them into action when Sir Peter Scott invited him to become involved in the founding of what was then the World Wildlife Fund, becoming its first president in 1961, a role he held for over 20 years, before becoming president of WWF International from 1981 to 1996. As Sir David Attenborough has said, his importance to conservation worldwide has been absolutely huge. And I particularly appreciate his impatience for change. He addressed the Conference on World Pollution in Strasbourg in 1970, telling his audience, "It is totally useless for a lot of well-meaning people to wring their hands in conference and to point out the dangers of pollution or the destruction of the countryside if no one is willing or capable of taking any action." And ever practical, he was also one of the first people in Britain to install solar panels at Sandringham. And back in 1982, almost 40 years ago, he brought up a global environmental threat that now makes headlines, but back then was rarely spoken of at all outside green circles. What he called a hotly debated issue directly attributed to the development of industry, the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the Duke of Edinburgh would have particularly relished a glowing tribute from the Green Movement. In an interview to celebrate his 90th birthday, in response to a question about whether he would consider himself a Green, after a moment's utter bemusement, he replied, "No," before famously going on to remark, "There's